at a very dangerous moment in our history and in the history of the world to address you on the subject of implications of a Zionist-Israeli attack on Iran, which now appears to be not only fairly certain, but also just around the corner. The minute Iran is attacked, they will recognize that the threshold has been crossed and that we are now moving inevitably towards nuclear war.
Iran is Israel's best friend, and we do not intend to change our position in relation to Tehran. Believe it or not, this is a quote from an Israeli prime minister. But it's not Ben Gurion or Golda Meir from the era of the Shah. It's actually from Yitzhak Rabin. The year is 1987. Ayatollah Khomeini is still alive, and much like Ahmadinejad today, he's using the worst rhetoric against Israel. Yet, Rabin referred to Iran as a geostrategic friend. The geostrategic friend. The geostrategic friend.
Our guest today is Trita Parsi, who is president of the National Iranian-American Council and adjunct professor of international relations at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. His new book is Treacherous Alliance: The Secret Dealings of Israel, Iran, and the U.S.
And what I did for the book is that I did about 130 interviews with decision makers in all three countries. And I think that's one of the biggest contributions in the book.
Today, when we hear the threats of war and the high rhetoric, we're oftentimes led to believe that this is yet another one of those unsolvable Middle Eastern conflicts with roots as old as the region itself. Nothing could be further from the truth. Rabin's statement was a reflection of decades of security and intelligence collaboration between the two, which in turn was born out of perception of common threats. Both states feared strong Arab states such as Egypt and Iraq. And in addition, the Israeli doctrine of the periphery, the idea that Israel's security was best achieved by creating alliances with the non-Arab states in the periphery of the region in order to balance the Arab states in its vicinity. With the Islamic Revolution in 1979, in spite of the very clear anti-Israeli ideology of the new regime, the geopolitical logic for their collaboration lived on because they still had common threats. And when Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, Israel feared an Iraqi victory and actively helped Iran by selling it arms and providing it with spare parts for Iran's American weaponry at a moment when Iran was very vulnerable because of an American arms embargo that Israel was more than happy to violate. In fact, back in the 1980s, it was Israel that lobbied Washington not to talk to Iran, to sell arms to Iran, and not pay attention to Iran's anti-Israeli ideology. And this, of course, climaxed in the Iran-Contra scandal of the 1980s. So Israel, who in the 1980s lobbied for an improved U.S.-Iran relations, now feared a U.S.-Iran rapprochement, thinking that it would come at Israel's security interests' expense, and instead sought to put Iran in increased isolation. Ironically, this was happening at a time when Iran was more interested in peacemaking with Washington than to see to Israel's destruction. And after having helped the United States indirectly in the war against Iraq in 1991, the Iranians were hoping that they would be rewarded by being included in the post-war security architecture of the region. The Iranians believed that, and the only way Iran could compel Washington to change its position was by imposing a cost on the US if it didn't. The easiest target was the peace process. And now the Iranian ideological bark was to be accompanied by a non-conventional bite. But according to Martin Indyk of the Clinton administration, the Iranians had not gotten it entirely wrong. So according to Indyk, and these are his words, the Iranians had an interest to do us in on the peace process in order to defeat our policy of containment. To defeat our policy of containment, not about ideology. But throughout even the worst times of their entanglement, all sides have reached out to each other. Netanyahu, when he got elected in 1996, reached out to the Iranians to see if there was any ways that the doctrine of the periphery could be resurrected. Tehran was not interested. A few years later, the Iranians sent a comprehensive negotiation proposal to the Bush administration. A proposal that revealed that there was some potential of getting Iran and Israel back on terms again. The Bush administration did not even respond. But this is not an ancient conflict. This is not even an ideological conflict. The ebbs and flows of hostility have not shifted with ideological zeal, but rather with changes in the geopolitical landscape. When Iran and Israel's security imperatives dictated collaboration, they did so in spite of lethal ideological opposition to each other. When Iran's ideological impulses collided with a strategic interest, the strategic interest always prevailed. In an ideological conflict, there can be no truce, no draw, no compromise. Only victory or defeat.
This is a ray of hope, the silver lining in the cloud. What a Revolutionary Guard guy said, why don't you Americans realize that we hate Arabs more than we hate the Israelis, and that we'd rather work with Israel to contain Arab power than to work with the Arabs to contain Israeli power.
There's a long history, you know, of that.
Yeah, I know, but we don't recognize that. We again, because of our ignorance, we go Muslim. They're all the same. They're not all the same.
And I never understood until now